In this video, I'm going to take a look at the Thypoch Eureka 50f2. It's a collapsible lens with a Leica M mount, but I'll be testing it on my Sony E-mount cameras. When Thypoch invited me to review the lens, I had a good long look at their website, and I like the way they're promoting the lens with an artistic style, the character and charm of a vintage lens in a distinctive body. You don't see many new collapsible lenses these days. It perfectly suits the kind of vintage meets modern lens I enjoy using and reviewing. There's another important reason why this lens is interesting to me. The lens is inspired by the classic Taylor-Hobson 2-inch f2 collapsible lens, an ultra-rare 50mm lens designed at the end of the 1940s for the Reid camera, a British copy of the Leica 3. The lens was advertised as the best British lens ever made, and it was highly regarded at the time, even at Leica. Not only can these rare lenses sell today for thousands of pounds, apparently it's hard to find versions with clear glass without haze. I own an old collapsible Leica Elma 50f3.5, and I've often wondered what it would be like to shoot with the Taylor-Hobson. Thanks to Thypoch, I now have the chance to at least get a flavour of the experience with their new lens. It's also a lens that promises to be sharp and a little swirly, and it should perform a little like those classic old Leica lenses, the collapsible Suma and Sumitar, two other very desirable lenses. So I accepted Thypoch's invitation, on the basis that I get to keep the lens if I post a review. I'll start off by talking about the lens specs, what it's like to use, and then I'll show you how it performs. I'll be demonstrating how the lens performs in action, using video clips rather than just still photos. The Eureka, with its more artsy style, is the perfect lens for this video plus stills approach. The lens is available in two versions. One version is made of aluminium, and the limited edition version is made of brass. The brass version is heavier and more expensive. Here's my copy of the lens. It comes in an attractively packaged box, and it's the aluminium version, or aluminum if you prefer. The lens is lightweight, but it feels solid and well made. Its silver finish looks very attractive to me. It comes with a UV filter and lens hood, reminiscent of the early Leica equipment. I kept the hood on all the time, and although I didn't use the filter for this review, it's good to have. In keeping with the artistic positioning of the lens, the box also includes a booklet showcasing photos taken with the lens. I really respect this inclusion. It gives the new owner ideas about the potential of using the lens in action. The first thing to note about this collapsible lens is that the body does not extend very far beyond the back of the lens mount. This is an issue that my old Elma suffers from, where the body is in danger of hitting a digital camera's sensor. The inner barrel of the lens has an engraved quote derived from René Magritte, another nice artistic touch. You only see this when the lens is collapsed back. Sitting on the camera before it's extended, the Eureka has a relatively small and neat look. Like the original Taylor-Hobson, it's not as flush to the camera as the old Leicas, but then, as I've said, the body would probably hit the sensor. I mostly used the lens on a Sony a7 IV, but I also had it on a Sony a6000 APS-C camera. The small size of the lens really suits the smaller mirrorless camera, and it's a pocketable combination if you have big jacket pockets. The Leica M to Sony E-mount adapters you can buy have nice low profiles, unlike some other lens mount adapters. It's a full-frame lens with 6 elements in 4 groups, and it has 12 aperture blades. The lens has a minimum focus distance of 0.9 meters. Not great compared to modern lenses, but I found this encouraged me to find different kinds of compositions and use different photographic techniques to my normal close-up, wide-open fascinations. The lens locks into its infinity position. I can see why it's an advantage to lock the focus ring, but it creates other issues when you're using the lens, which I'll discuss later. To use the lens, you simply pull up the barrel and lock it into place. The focus ring and unclicked aperture ring are well damped. They're a pleasure to turn. So let's get on with a demonstration of how the lens performs in action, starting with the lens's sharpness, wide open and stop down. Wide open, I've been very impressed with the lens's center sharpness. A lot of details have been captured on this tabletop test. Perhaps a more interesting example of the lens's sharpness wide open is this leaf, videoed handheld. Here's the full-frame photo I took of the leaf. Zooming into the photo, you can see even more clearly how a spider's web is holding the leaf up, all sharply captured by the Eureka. For closer-up shots, the lens sharpens up as you stop down, but it's perfectly usable wide open if you want. For infinity shots, the lens also performs well wide open. I own plenty of fast 50s that don't render the details of Chiswick House so well wide open. One word on infinity shots. On my Leica M mount to Sony E mount adapter, the lens wasn't actually operating at infinity when it was locked on the focus ring. Infinity for my setup was just before the lock position, and I sometimes found myself moving the focus ring too far and locking the lens at infinity by mistake while I was trying to focus, something to be aware of. To show you how the rendering of infinity images changes as the lens is stopped down, I'll video the whole process, from f2 to f16. Apart from the movement of the camera as I rotate the aperture ring, and changes as the camera adjusts the exposure settings, it's not easy to spot the difference in rendering as the aperture blades are closed down. Looking at stills images wide open and stopped down, if you pixel peep, the differences in detail are apparent, but they're not huge. More obvious is the vignetting wide open. You can see it in the darkening of the sky around the edges. I don't know whether this is specifically caused by using the M-mount lens adapted to my Sony camera, but it's not dark enough to concern me. Indeed, I rather like a little vignetting on my closer-up wide-open images. It can help to create more of a 3D pop. The vignetting also appears wide open, snapping objects against a white background, such as this curiosity at an art gallery, so it's best to stop down, or use the lens in crop mode in these situations. Anyway, in terms of sharpness, my conclusion is that you can be confident of using this lens wider open in many situations. It'll produce a good sharp result on the in-focus parts of the image. And stop down, the images have good micro details, and you can safely zoom or crop into those images. I was interested to see how the lens performed in terms of colours and contrasts. This is an area where my old Leitz Elmar 53.5 is quite weak. It's a sharp lens, but the colour contrasts really need boosting. Thypoch has done a good job with the design of the glass and coatings. The Eureka doesn't suffer from weak contrasts and colours. On the contrary, the colours and contrasts are quite strong. In fact, you have to be careful with the exposure settings to avoid too strong light and dark contrasts. Here are some straight out of camera images using Sony's standard JPEG settings, showing blues and reds and yellows. I found the colours are actually rather rich, sometimes on the warm side, and if you slightly underexpose an image, you can get rather nice warm vintage tones. So if you like these kinds of vintage tones, I think you'll like this lens. The lens was certainly a good choice for videos and photographs capturing autumn colours at the time of this review. Here's a compilation of 5 different views through the arches of a railway bridge. I really enjoyed using the lens as a walk-around lens, adjusting the aperture settings a lot more than I normally do to control exposure levels, helped by that clickless aperture ring. The lens's combination of sharpness and colour contrasts works well outdoors and indoors, even in challenging light conditions. These photos were taken on a very grey day in London. And I had an extremely productive shoot inside the Tate Gallery. I'll share a few of the results without further comment. And then there are black and white images. It was a lot of fun taking video clips and photographs with my camera on a black and white setting, i.e. where the files are monochrome straight out of camera. Given the strong contrasts, the lens produces excellent results in black and white. I imagined if you owned a camera designed to take only monochrome images, the Eureka would be an excellent choice as a compact, creative fast 50. I'll leave you momentarily with some more black and white examples. One aspect of sharpness I always like to look at with lenses I'm reviewing involves the transitions from in to out of focus. It's a good test of in-focus sharpness and how smooth and natural looking the transitions are wide open. A good way to look at transitions is to take shots down railings and fences. The Eureka's transitions look good, and that's hardly surprising, as the lens has a quite long minimum focus distance at 0.9 meters. This means there's not such a narrow depth of field with this lens, and the transitions are going to look more natural, i.e. the in-focus areas are not so isolated. I'd have preferred a shorter MFD, so I could focus closer on subjects and maximize the bokeh potential, but there are ways around this. For example, if you're using a crop sensor camera, or your full-frame camera has a crop sensor mode, you can get a closer framing for your in-focus subject. These railings were shot on my Sony a7 IV's 1.5 times crop mode, as was this fruit bowl. There's a nice sense of isolation with these shots, and nice bubbles. I'll return to bubbles later. Another technique for close-up shots, of course, is to use extension tubes, and the lens works well here. It's sharp enough wide open for macro shots like these. However, with these macro shots, I found it does help to stop down for optimal sharpness, and the good news is that the bokeh is still reasonably dreamy here. Talking about dreamy bokeh, it's time to see the Eureka's rendering of out-of-focus blur. One of my favourite subjects for capturing bokeh is this VW Beetle, a car that fortunately for me rarely seems to move from its parking spot. Starting with this shot, I do like the way the lens has rendered this lighter area of the image. I think it looks very artistic. On the darker side of the car, the background blur hasn't been completely smoothed out, but you wouldn't expect that for an f2 lens, and in this particular composition, there's not much you can do with the darker shadows in the background. These strong contrasts, however, can be turned to your advantage, and the bokeh can be quite funky. I think that's the right word. Especially when combined with the bubbles from out-of-focus highlights. I'll talk more about the bubbles in a minute or so. Where there is a lighter and not too busy a background, the rendering is nice and smooth. The Eureka can produce fine portraits, straight out of camera, in colour and in black and white. As you'd anticipate from a 50 f2 lens, it's not going to render the kind of narrow depth of field wide open you'll have from f1.2 or f1.4 lenses, but to me the results can look more natural. It's quite capable of attractive subject isolation, without a sudden drop-off in focus across the face. And with busy backgrounds, the rendering of the out-of-focus areas certainly has a lot of character. One more important point to make about the lens wide open, and that concerns ghosting and chromatic aberrations. This is one of my go-to scenes for capturing purple and green fringing. If a lens is prone to fringing, the fringing is invariably picked up on the white letters or along the wall against the brightly lit sky. Furthermore, if a lens is prone to ghosting wide open, it'll also be picked up on the sign. The lens does a good job here. There's no ghosting on the white lettering, and no fringing either, and perhaps only a tiny hint of fringing on the edge of the wall, and that's a very impressive result wide open. Elsewhere, in extreme conditions, the lens can produce fringing, but it's extreme conditions, not the norm. Now on to how the Eureka renders out-of-focus highlights, and specifically a look at the bokeh bubbles it produces. Take a walk down a street with a low sun in the distance, start to focus on subjects near at hand wide open, and it's almost impossible not to shoot images with bubbles. Or go into the woods and take shots into the branches of trees, and you'll also see lots of bubbles. I'm going to show you some of the favourite shots I've taken with bubbles, and while we look at these images, there are two observations I'd like to make. The first observation is that when you use the Eureka wide open, in the right conditions with the right light and backgrounds, it produces a lot of interesting bokeh and a lot of bubbles. This is busier bokeh with smaller bubbles than you typically see with a faster lens with a shorter MFD. So you have to embrace the bokeh, turn it to your advantage, treat it like the lens's artistic superpower. In this image, for example, I think the out-of-focus effects are really artistic. The bubble bokeh is obvious, but even areas of the image, such as this area, have a rather lovely artistic texture. The second observation to make from the bubbles, especially bubbles from a lot of small bright highlights, is that the lens produces swirly bokeh. I post-processed this still photo to enhance the swirly effects the lens produces. And another example, the video is straight out of camera while I've slightly enhanced the still photo. So what happens to the bubbles when you start to stop down? I found the most effective way of showing what happens is to use the lens with an extension tube, as this produces much larger bubbles, and you can see the impact of the aperture blades on those bubbles. The edges of the blades don't start to show significantly until around f4, so this means you can stop down a reasonable way and still see nice round balls. Finally, sunbursts and flares. Stop right down to f16, the lens's 12 blades produce clean starbursts. As well as starbursts, you can see some flaring, but these are pretty extreme conditions where neither a hood nor coatings will be a lot of help. Wide open, the lens is capable of some nice flares when it's pointed into the brightest light. I rather like lenses that flare in this way. It's fun to play with the effects. I didn't see a lot of flares from light passing across the front of the lens, and I'm sure using the hood does help. It may be a little cliched to say that my time with the Eureka has been a voyage of discovery, but it's true. The lens has been quite a challenge, and a very enjoyable challenge. A collapsible lens is a different user experience, going back in time, and it's the kind of lens that forces you to think more carefully about your photography and your compositions. And compared to the original Taylor-Hobson, it's great value. If you search online for photos taken with that lens, to highlight just one example, I think the similarities with the Eureka are obvious. So thank you, Thypoch, for all the skills, time, and effort it takes to produce such a wonderful recreation of the original. It's quite a quirky lens compared to modern digital designs, the collapsible body, the way it locks the focus on the infinity mark, and the long minimum focus distance. This is not your average fast 50. It's a lens for people who love lenses with a lot of character, where vintage meets modern. What I particularly like about the lens is it takes me out of my comfort zones, which tend to fluctuate between close-up compositions taken wide open and infinity shots fixed at f5.6 or f8. It's a lens that will encourage you to work harder to find different kinds of compositions. I don't think I've ever been so conscious of the need to try and use a lens as an artistic tool, not simply trying to take an accurate record of what's in front of me, or playing with more abstract out-of-focus effects. It'll also encourage you to use different photographic techniques. For example, I don't think I've ever used the aperture blade so much to adjust exposure levels rather than the shutter speed, and I love using the de-clicked aperture ring for photos as well as videos. As I mentioned at the start, the lens promised to be sharp and swirly, and it certainly delivers. Compared to the originals, the Eureka's glass is not only brand new and clean, the coatings produce better colours and contrasts. So you're getting the best of both worlds, the old and the new with this lens. If you're interested in buying the lens, I've included an affiliate link to Thypoch's website in the description below. If you click on this link, you'll be helping my channel. So until the next time, all the best.